Everyone knows therapy is great for solving problems, but getting therapy has its own problems too, like finding the right therapist, fitting into their schedule, and of course, the cost. Well, BetterHelp can solve those problems. It's totally online and built around your schedule. It's surprisingly affordable too. Connect with a credentialed therapist by phone, video, or online chat, all from the comfort of your home. Visit BetterHelp.com to learn more and save 10% on your first month. That's BetterHelp, H-E-L-P.
Need new glasses or want a fresh new style? Warby Parker has you covered. Glasses start at just $95, including anti-reflective, scratch-resistant prescription lenses that block 100% of UV rays. Every frame's designed in-house with a huge selection of styles for every face shape. And with Warby Parker's free home try-on program, you can order 5 pairs to try at home for free. Shipping is free both ways, too. Go to warbyparker.com/covered to try 5 pairs of frames at home for free. warbyparker.com/covered.
Hello, this is Danny Pellegrino, host of the Everything Iconic podcast, and I'm here to tell you all about Splash Refresher, because hydration is mandatory, but boring is not. Now, I love my water, but if I don't spice it up, I'm not going to finish what I took out of the fridge. That's why I love my Splash Refresher, which is flavorful, delicious, bright, hydrating, and 0 calories. The wild berry flavor is my fave. No, wait, is the pineapple mango flavor my fave? You know what? All 5 craveable Splash Refresher flavors are my fave because they're so delicious. So get hydrated and enjoy it with Splash Refresher.
The rabbit out of the hat has turned into like the political equivalent of Watership Down in terms of just like absolute
dead rabbits everywhere.
Loads of slain rabbits everywhere. Everyone's sick of dead bunnies now. Welcome to the Power Test. I'm Ayesha Hazarika.
And I'm Sam Freedman. Welcome to this week's Power Test, and it's a special week because in a way it's what we've been building up to for the whole time we've been doing the podcast. We now have a Labour manifesto which sets out their programme for government. So does it meet their Power Test? Are they really ready for government? What does it tell us about their plans? What are the holes? What are the good things in it? We've got some great guests joining us in a bit. But Ayesha, first up, what did you make of today, how it was presented, how it came across? What are your initial thoughts?
Well, first of all, just relieved to see a manifesto because it feels like it's been building up for so much time and everyone's like, show me the money, show me the money. And finally, we get it. We'll move into the substance later. Just from a sort of political and communications and presentation point of view, I thought that it was all very, very slick. And it does show that Starmer's team and he have had rigor, which has paid off. They have had a discipline. They have had a story. They've had these missions, which then sort of bled into these pledges, which have then produced the manifesto. So while there wasn't anything kind of wildly new and shiny about the manifesto, it felt like it was meticulous. It felt like it was very well considered. It was very slick. It felt very coherent. It felt very, very professional. It felt like it was a real kind of creature of the Starmer project.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it was very much in his image and written in his image. One of the things I actually really liked about it, the presentation, was he made a big point out of there not being any surprises, out of there not being a rabbit to be pulled out of the hat, which the media are all obsessed with. What's the rabbit? What's the rabbit? It was something that they have built up over several years in this quite methodical way. And they're not going to throw in a bunch of surprises just to get attention now. Not that they need attention, obviously, because they're so far ahead. And, you know, it's better for them to sort of carry on with the attention being on the Tory party falling apart. But nevertheless, I thought it was quite a encouraging approach. If they keep that going in government, if they focus on actually trying to do things rather than getting attention for stuff, then they have a much better chance of success than the current government, who have spent all their time getting attention and not any time actually doing anything. So I thought that was a really positive element of it.
I think you're so right. I think this concept of the rabbit out of the hat is so over now, because the rabbit out of the hat has turned into like the political equivalent of Watership Down in terms of just like absolute
dead rabbits everywhere.
Loads of slain rabbits everywhere. Everyone's sick of dead bunnies now. Like, we don't want any more dead bunnies. We just want like a credible government. Well, look, let's introduce our 2 brilliant guests for this special edition of the Power Test. Delighted to welcome Nick Pearce, who leads the Institute for for policy research at the University of Bath. And between 2008 and 2010, Nick was the head of the Number 10 Policy Unit. He was also a special advisor at the Home Office, Cabinet Office and Department of Education. And Nick has had much experience of putting together manifestos. Nick, welcome.
Thanks very much. Very nice to be here. Yeah.
And also welcome to this episode is Claire Ainsley. Claire is a director of the project on centre-left renewal at the Progressive Policy Institute. And Claire was previously Keir Starmer's executive policy director from 2020 to 2022 and one of our very first ever guests on the podcast. I'm sure that is the first thing on your CV, Claire.
It totally is. Thanks for having me back.
So can we start with Nick? Because you were very involved in writing the 2010 manifesto for Labour. Give us a bit of an insight into the process of putting together these sort of enormous, complicated documents. Where do you start? How do you get from A to Z?
Actually, I have an unpublished manifesto somewhere on my hard drive from 2007, because we had to be ready in case Gordon chose to call an election, which of course famously he didn't. And we had to scrabble around very, very quickly to put together a manifesto, which in the end was never published. That was rather different to 2010 because obviously we knew then he was going the full term and we had quite a lot of time to run up to it. It is slightly different in government to opposition because in government you are resting in large part on policies that you've developed with the civil service that your ministers have worked on in their departments. Some of it is about projecting into the future, things which haven't been worked up in government. And the Tory manifesto had a lot of that, as we've seen. But for the most part, you are in a process of going around some big egos in the cabinet, getting them to agree to the structure and content of a manifesto. You don't share the pen because you don't want lots of different writing styles. You don't want the tone to be inconsistent. You want a consistent tone and theme throughout. And of course, you have to work with the Treasury on what can and can't be afforded and all the fiscal implications. So you do all that kind of stuff, which you have to do in opposition as well. And you do try to give it some lift and purpose. Labour manifestos in particular need to speak to people's ambitions for the country. Certainly in 2010, Ed Miliband was the campaign coordinator or the manifesto coordinator. And he wanted to tell a story about a different kind of post-crisis capitalism. And that was intended to infuse the document. So you try to get some big themes in there as well as the nitty-gritty of policy. What
was the biggest policy from 2007 that's never been told to anybody before that you really would love to have been in 2010, but there was no money by 2010?
A lot of it was what had been announced when Gordon took over. And of course, it was pre-financial crisis. So all of the things that then happened, of course, were not registered at all.
I remember that period very well because I had just started as a special advisor just before we went to Labour Party conference, just before all the speculation started. And I remember, I think I'd only been a special advisor for about 2 weeks and then suddenly was summoned into like our Friday SPADS meeting, which we called SPAD School. And I remember you very solemnly saying to us, and there was me and Polly Billington, we were completely new special advisors. And you were like, right, you all have to go back to your departments and come back with some manifesto ideas. And we were like, we've only been here for 2 weeks. How is this even possible?
No, absolutely. It is a slightly weird process. And you have, of course, also with the document itself, you have to have high secrecy about it. You can't share it around. So you can only share chapters with individual cabinet ministers. You can't share the whole thing, only with the Treasury, really, and the Prime Minister or leader of the party and the leader's team. And of course, you must make sure it doesn't leak. So I can remember certainly the feeling of huge relief as the Labour head of policy in 2010 when we'd actually just got the thing launched and out. The thing was in public and you didn't need to worry anymore.
Yeah. The secrecy thing can cause issues that I remember because I was working on the 2010 manifesto for the other side, but I had only worked on the education bit. So none of us had seen the actual full manifesto until the day it was published, precisely because of this point about secrecy. And it turned out, we all got our copy, turned out Steve Hilton insisted on calling it an invitation to join the government of Britain, which we all thought was unbearably sort of cringe. We just all sat there going, oh God, we don't want this on the cover of our work.
Although you say that, Sam, I do remember the front cover, and this is no offence to you, Nick, because it was a very good manifesto, even though we didn't win the general election. The cover of the 2010 manifesto was a bit weird. It did slightly look like Children of the Corn. Do you remember it had like
the future fair for all, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
Claire, give us some insight into policy making under Keir Starmer. How do the nuts and bolts work?
The Starmer process is very methodical, actually. So in the early days, much of what we needed to do was to distance ourselves from some of the previous policy. But we partly didn't want to just distance ourselves without having something new to say. Otherwise, it felt like positioning for the sake of it. So it felt probably quite tortuous at the time, but now looks quite efficient, actually. We went through this process called Stronger Together that party chair Annalisa Dodds led on, which actually enabled us to come up with some of the alternatives to what we'd previously been suggesting, rather than saying, oh, everything that went before wasn't right, because actually some of it we built on and some of it we needed to distance ourselves from. And then, of course, we've had these Starmer missions, which actually were an innovation from the German Social Democrats. They had these 4 missions for the future in their manifesto, and they still had really like election ready pledges. So they had really bread and butter things that they went to voters with, but it was a way of communicating the scale of the challenges we've got today, but also make the first steps really tangible. So that's been the inspiration really for these missions, and then the first steps on the way. So yeah, under Starmer, a very methodical process, and I think you see the fruits of that today.
How personally involved is he in policy making as a leader? Because some party leaders really get into the details, others are like, well, that's for other people, I'm the front man.
I really liked working for him, and I didn't know him very well before I worked for him, but I found him like a chief executive in actually in good ways, in a successful chief exec, which is they set the vision, they set the culture, and then they appoint people around them who know lots about the subject. And ultimately, he would take the political decisions, but he did expect shadow cabinet members and their teams to do a lot of work. He appointed people into those big roles like Wes Streeting and others who have actually come up with quite a lot of the goods themselves. So he wanted an oversight of everything. He had particular areas he's always going to be interested in, but he wasn't a micromanager.
There's a big debate going on about the merits of steady as you go and the fact that this manifesto didn't have anything massively new, the rabbit out of the hat. And there's lots of people saying, well, look, that's really important in terms of winning the election. But in terms of the bold policy, what stood out to you as sort of really exciting and different, or something that you thought, yeah, this is what I've been looking for?
Well, I think, Labour has a challenge, and the manifesto has this sort of challenge going through it, which is that the scale of the problems that the country faces, that Labour inherits, it's probably the worst inheritance of a Labour Prime Minister coming into government, certainly since 1974 and perhaps since 45. And the scale of those challenges calls forth, quite big responses, because, they are very profound. Our economy, productivity problems, lack of investment, lack of growth. We all know the story on our public services. We can see it all around us. And so a manifesto has to tell a story about the country and why it needs to change. That story has almost been told for Labour by the events of recent years and by the state of the country. It's very easy to do declinist discourse at the moment and to leverage that decline to make the case for the alternative, for the change. But it does then open up the challenge that you yourself have got to fill in what it is you're going to do to meet those challenges and to deal with the state the country's in. That, of course, is the major problem on the public services, as we know, has been endlessly debated in recent months and certainly today about, the scale of the implied cuts to some services which are already on their knees in local government and elsewhere. And on our economy, although there's a huge amount of focus on economic growth, it's going to take a long time to get the British economy to be invested more strongly again, to deal with our productivity challenge, to improve our trade with Europe, all of these things. There are lots of areas where the manifesto says very little. There's lots of reviews. There's lots of areas where things just aren't talked about at all. In my own area of higher education, there's hardly anything. But in other areas, there's quite a lot of detail on things like housing, for example. It's clear that they've decided to make a big, quite a bold set of policies that there's, and political capital staked on getting more house building. I think there's some interesting things in the manifesto precisely because so much is placed on growth and because there's less of a sort of emphasis on distributional questions and on the welfare state and services and so on. There's quite a focus on production, what we make, what we build, our energy system, the material basis of the economy, in ways that feel a bit more like the kind of manifestos you would read in 45 and 64, which had a much stronger focus on the productive base of the economy, on industry and so on. And by default, Labour will take some things into public ownership in ways that it hasn't promised to do for some time. The railways, obviously, municipal bus ownership and regulation, Great British Energy, of course. We'll probably end up seeing a Labour government nationalise Thames Water. And so by default, almost, there's a sort of shift in tone and stance on those kinds of questions. And on workers' rights, the package, despite what some union leaders have said, is a fairly radical package. So there are some interesting issues there, sort of a shift towards thinking much more about how people work, how they're rewarded and paid, what we do as a country, what we make and build, and less of a focus on consumption and distribution than you might have seen in the past.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. When I read it, I felt like it was really quite lopsided in that on the economy, on economic questions, there is a lot of ambition and detail. It would be very wrong not to see this as a radical manifesto on that side of it. And then you get to the public services side of it, and there's a very good problem statement, which set out everything that's going wrong. And there's some very good ambitions. And then in the middle, there's this kind of hole where some money needs to be, and they're not prepared to sort of say that at the moment. So the health section to me sort of felt like a really good example. Really clear statement of the problem, huge waiting lists, A&E a complete disaster, preventative health hasn't happened, all correct, tick, tick, tick. Very good ambition, want to get waiting lists back down to essentially where they were in 2010. And then they say in the middle, we're going to buy some MRI scanners and CT scanners. And you're just like, well, that's not going to get us from where we are now, which is certainly not the Labour Party's fault, but nevertheless is a really big mess, to where we want to get to. Child poverty, and again, really clear problem statement, 700,000 more kids in poverty, terrible disaster for all sorts of reasons. Good ambition to sort of get back to where we were, again, under the last Labour government. But then they start talking about breakfast clubs, which are a perfectly good policy, but are absolutely not going to get child poverty down by 700,000. So there's this sort of hole on that side of the manifesto, which is not there on the economic side, which is much stronger.
But Sam, do you think that is because they don't have the answers? Because I read it much more as a statement of political power. There are lots of places, and you and Nick have just highlighted them, where Labour don't have to say the detail of what they're going to do on HE funding, because that would probably take another 128 pages and some really big, difficult decisions, I think. There are lots of areas where more could be said, but the question they're answering is not an essay question that we have to assess, have they given a comprehensive plan here for Britain? It is, what is the mandate on which we're going to be elected? And I thought that it was symptomatic of their big poll lead and Starmer's strength, that they were really able to, in lots of ways, like you, Nick, I looked on higher education, an area of interest, and I know that we had, even when I was there, many more detailed discussions than are reflected in the document. So I took it as a symptom of the strength that Starmer and Labour have with their poll lead, rather than necessarily because they don't have the answers. I think they're giving themselves some wiggle room.
Yeah, and I certainly don't think it's going to cause them any political damage to not have that detail in a manifesto at this point, for all the reasons that you say. I think my worry is just that we don't know if they've got the answer. Like, if they can get to ending waiting lists, I don't care if they say how they're going to do it in this document. But it's a huge ask. Not very many experts in the health sector think it's achievable. It's certainly not achievable without significant additional investment. So if there is that answer somewhere, great. I just don't know because they haven't told us. And that, I think, for someone who isn't, a natural Labour supporter, that's what still gives me concern.
Yeah, and there are some areas where they are basically saying, trust us. Like on child poverty, you're absolutely right, Sam. And everybody knows that getting rid of the 2-child limit is absolutely necessary if you're going to reduce child poverty. And if you don't do it, it's going to go up. Really what Labour's saying in the manifesto and been saying in interviews is, look, trust us on child poverty because we're the party that's done it before. We'll do it again. That is a sort of just a sense of a promise in who the Labour Party are. In other areas, I think they genuinely don't have answers worked out. And, manifestos often don't say things because parties either don't want to commit themselves or they haven't worked it out yet. And I think there's quite a lot of that probably in the manifesto. There are lots of reviews.
I think there was 14 reviews.
I think it's a balance. Some of it is politics. Some of it is about, policy substance and the preoccupations of different shadow ministers, because obviously, and it was the same in 1997. If you had very good shadow ministers who'd done the work, it was immediately obvious in the manifesto. And then when they got into government, and if they hadn't done that work, it was also obvious where there were gaps, and the performance in the first Labour term reflected that. So There will be some of this is also just about the time and effort and intellectual work, policy work that people have put in before the manifesto has been drafted.
And I think we also have to recognise that the reality is that probably the snap election has had an impact on this as well. I think a lot of thinking has been done, but it would be interesting to see how a manifesto which came out in October or November maybe differed from what we have seen today. I mean, I think from a political point of view, it's really slick and it's really good and it's really safe. And it's going to absolutely make sure that this big poll lead is not damaged. I was at an event last week where somebody asked the question, are you absolutely sure that you have gone through this with a fine tooth comb to make sure that there are no nasties in this document? Because that's the kind of thing that could really derail the campaign right now as postal votes are beginning to drop. Clearly, they have done that. I'm not saying that in a dismissive way. I think that is actually incredibly important, particularly for a Labour Party that got addicted to danger and indulgence and, you know, everybody can have a karaoke machine and an owl and everything they want. But I do think Phil Collins summed it up today. He said the manifesto will work and it will leave the question of what the Labour government will really be like for another day. And I think there's probably quite a lot of truth in that. And I think to your point, Claire, a prospective government cannot look into the future and foresee every single circumstance, and they can't map out every single bit of policy. My anxiety is the reliance on growth, because I think the recipe for growth in there is really good. Having a proper industrial strategy is important. Having stability and securenomics is very important. Having a proper regional skill strategy is really important. All of that is really important. The but, though, is that all of this stuff, and we spoke to Nick McPherson on some of our early episodes, and he was really saying that skills is incredibly important if you want to boost productivity. The big but, though, is that growth and all these ingredients for growth, they take time. They take actually quite a bit of investment, initial investment to get the infrastructure up. It's not the sexiest work in the world. Like, you've got to really be prepared to put in quite a long shift into it. But I think Starmer's up for that. But also the truth is quite a lot of growth, as well as putting those good ingredients down, also relies on a bit of luck. And if something unforeseen were to happen in this very fragile world and growth gets hampered and harmed by that, that's a problem, isn't it?
Well, I certainly wouldn't have committed to the highest sustained growth in the G7. I don't know why Labour made that its first mission, because, I mean, that's dependent on what other people do. There's just an element of that, of trying to be world leading, superpower this, top of the world in that G7, etc. I mean, I personally would be a bit more humble about those sorts of things. You know, we have a major problem with economic growth and productivity, and we have a major investment problem. I think the manifesto addresses the investment problem, or it seeks to at least spell it out in ways that haven't been done before. And we have an inequality problem. It says less on inequality. And so the risk is not just that you don't get growth, the risk is also that that growth is not widely shared across the country, that it doesn't lead to productivity improvements in, you know, what people call the foundational or everyday economy, that the returns to growth aren't more regionally distributed and so on. But 'twas ever thus for Labour governments. It's not that growth has not been a central objective of Labour governments in the past. It's simply that what Labour inherits this time, in terms of the previous 14 years, well, since the financial crisis essentially, is much worse than it is inherited in the past in terms of the state of the economy and economic performance.
And I think it relates to something which isn't in the manifesto and was never going to be, which is the question of Europe, which they've done a very good job of not talking about for obvious reasons that we don't need to rehearse again. But you are going to have a parliament that looks like it's going to be almost all MPs who voted for Remain. You're going to have a situation in which the Lib Dems could even be the opposition, but if they're not, they're going to be probably not that many seats behind the Conservatives, or it's certainly possible there won't be that many seats behind the Conservatives. And they have put rejoining the single market in their manifesto, so you will have a voice pushing it in the next parliament as well. If you don't get that growth, if it doesn't come as a result of the policies in this manifesto, and we get to year 2, year 3, public sector still creaking, you can't do any more on tax because you've already put it up, and people are sort of fed up with it. Do you think there is going to be a sort of movement within the Labour Party, Claire, where Europe starts to become a big issue again, simply because it's one of the few things you can do, not immediately, but relatively quickly, that would undoubtedly have an impact on GDP?
I think it could be an issue in the future, and I think you're right that it's an issue in policy terms now, but politically, I think most people think that that ship has sailed. I can't see it emerging as a short-term fix, if you like, around growth. It may be a question for future. I think the bigger question is the one that Ayesha hit on, which is what we heard today at the launch was really immediate problems. I mean, Keir used this example of having gone to, I forget the hospital he went to, but the biggest reason 6 to 10-year-olds are being admitted for surgery is dentistry. It is a total crisis picture for people. And with the best will in the world, a long-term plan for economic growth is not going to fix teeth quickly, and that is where we are, and cancer diagnostics and all the rest of it. So there is that gap, but this is not something that if Rachel Reeves was listening to this, she'd go, "Dong, I hadn't thought of that." Like, clearly the Labour team have thought about it, and they're buying themselves, I think, some room to be able to move on it. Partly what struck me in reading with it was when you put it all together, it is a massive plan. It's a really big plan, and there are lots of really big structural reforms. And remember when Rishi came out with his 5 pledges, I thought, oh, these are rubbish. This is like, when you're at work and you do your objectives and it's just the stuff that you're supposed to do anyway, like turn up. I thought it was really unambitious, but actually he's not been able to do them. So my worry is a little bit that we haven't got the finances available to do what we need to do for the ideas that we've got. And we've got a level of ambition that actually government is going to find really difficult. And if we spin too many plates, then some of them are going to smash.
I think that's so important, Claire. And we were at a conference a few weeks ago where some of your colleagues from Washington were over, and we were discussing what's happening in America and what's happening here. One of your brilliant colleagues just said the big lesson I would give to the Labour Party is really prioritise, like don't try and do too much too quickly. Those words really, really stayed with me. I mean, Sam, given the many constraints that we talk about, what do you think are the things that Labour should really, really focus on? I mean, as Claire said, this is a very ambitious blueprint or red print or whatever you want to call it, but there's only going to be so much that Labour can focus on.
Partly you don't get to decide, right? It's what's thrown at you. I don't think Nick wanted to focus on the financial crisis. You have to deal with the hand you get. And I think there'll be a lot of crises that hit straight away. Just to give some that we know about, prisons are full. They put a thing in the manifesto about removing planning restrictions to build them faster. It's still going to take a couple of years. You just have a massive problem straight away with what you do about that. Another one is teacher pay and NHS pay, nurse and doctor pay as well, where we've got pay review bodies that have been held off during the election. They're going to report straight after the election. A decision has to be made immediately. They're going to be essentially calls for big additional funding for the NHS and schools. And that's a decision that Rachel Reeves and those cabinet ministers will have to take straight away. So there's stuff like that just hits you straight off the bat. So you don't have that much space to prioritise. The things I'd really like to see them focus on, as well as the big policy areas, getting down waiting lists, trying to grow the economy, I'd love to see them focus on the systems and structures that underpin a lot of politics. There's a bit about devolution in there, which is slightly further than the Conservatives have gone, but not much further. I'd love to see them push further on regional devolution because I think that's absolutely essential to growth. I want to see them focus on sort of trying to sort out Whitehall. Whitehall is in a complete mess at the moment. It's going to be very, very difficult to make policy happen in a civil service that's really been broken by the last 8 years. So there's a lot of quite boring under the bonnet stuff that if they don't focus on that, they're going to find any other policy priority really difficult to do because nothing actually works. The levers don't pull anything. I don't know if you think if I'm being unfair, Nick, in terms of sort of where you obviously still talk to plenty of policymakers, but it really feels like Whitehall isn't functioning properly at the moment at all.
Yeah, and I think the danger of asking Whitehall to deliver all sorts of missions is that you then turn those into a whole set of targets, another round of kind of new public management, and you impose all that on the system, on schools and local government, all the rest of it, who simply don't have the resources, the staffing to cope with that. So there are big issues about the infrastructure and capabilities of the British state at work at the moment. Like you, I think the picture on English devolution is a good one. Most of the time in British politics, our institutions incrementally evolve and they get embedded and built upon. They don't kind of spring up out of crises. They're never created from nothing. Even the National Health Service built on all sorts of previous reforms. The beverage reforms were built on a whole load of Edwardian and 20s and 30s reforms and so on. So something like the combined authorities in England, having been established, developed, Labour now committing to spreading them across all of England and devolving more powers, that is a good set of reforms in my view. And I think Labour should be thinking a bit more along those lines in other areas, thinking about where do we need to deepen certain institutions, the Low Pay Commission, or where do we need to think about giving new remits and ambitions to institutions? Where do we need to think of reforming them to extend them? And in what areas do we need to think not in terms of a policy or a transfer or a target, but actually the creation of an institution and what it would do? So, for example, fair work agreements in social care. What you want that to do is to create a structure which can endure over many years for terms and conditions, pay and funding and career progression and skills development in the social care sector. You'd create an institution which will kind of house that development. So someone like me, I've always been very interested and committed to kind of democratic and constitutional reform. There's less of that than I would like in the Labour manifesto. It's pretty thin gruel if you're a democratic reform. There's nothing on electoral reform. The House of Lords reform has been shrunk right back. We could have done a lot more experimenting with citizens' assemblies, participatory democracy, empowering local government, lots of that stuff, which Labour reformers, Liberal Democrats, proportional representation advocates, all those sorts of people, they won't find much in the manifesto, I'm afraid. The Starmer government will certainly not manage to match what Blair achieved in 97. It's not going to have that kind of government, clearly.
No. The other thing that I've been thinking quite a lot about is the issue of care. There's quite a lot of stakeholders who are pleased that there are ideas to build this national care service in the Labour manifesto, but it feels like even though there were not really detailed proposals on care must be something that an incoming Labour government really thinks about and really tries to, in the time that it has. It feels like care is an issue which, if you really want to talk about the fabric of society and you really want to talk about renewal of Britain, it feels just remiss to not really find some way to crack this awful care conundrum that we're in.
I think that's right. And I think it's also so critical to local government finance as well. And I think that might be the trigger in a way of having to bring forward a different settlement on how care is funded, because that is so crucial to resolving what you would do with a national care service. So there's lots of very good ideas about how you would deliver a better care service, but essentially, unless you're going to introduce the cap, you're going to have a contributory insurance scheme or some other way of funding it, it feels like it's just going to topple over the way it's going. It feels like local government is becoming reduced to being a provider of some people's adult social care and emergency children's social care, and that is just not adequate democratically or for those people. So I think it will, but I share the concern that it's not featured as strongly as it might, and there isn't really that sort of build-up of a public conversation around what those options might be. That might be very un-Labour. It might not be very much like a National Health Service. And I think there is a bit of a need, I think, quite soon after an election for many of us who are not tied by being in a Labour government and having to toe a particular line to actually float what some of those proposals might be. There's been a huge amount of discipline outside of Labour, but I think it's really stifled some of those ideas coming forward because we are not getting them anytime soon in the way that we are currently handling adult social care.
Yeah, I very much agree with what Claire says. I mean, the failure to reform the funding of social care is one that goes back, across governments of all complexions over the last sort of 30 odd years. And it's in a situation now where reform is imperative. The system is completely on its last legs. The local government, 80% of local government is now children's care and care of adults. And services are poor. They rely on badly paid migrant labour to no satisfaction of anybody. It's crying out for a social insurance mechanism of some kind and a proper structure of funding that you can then match your institutional reforms to. That hasn't been something that's been achieved. And I think you have to ask yourself the question, why not? Why was it possible, for example, for the last Labour government and then the coalition to implement radical pensions reforms following the Turner Commission? extending pension state age, increasing re-indexing, triple lock, all that, auto enrolments, and nothing equivalent on social care. For my part, I think that's because older voters, who are critical in this election as they have been in the last 4 or 5 elections, do not want to pay more wealth tax in particular, or from their housing assets, for that care. And politicians don't want to ask the working age population to pay. So we're stuck.
And it goes to this sort of lack of focus on local government in this manifesto and the manifestos more broadly, in that there's a whole bunch of stuff that local government is expected to do, social care being the most expensive of it, but you can also include children's residential care, childcare as well, which is predominantly provided by the private sector, where the markets, those private sector markets, have gone haywire over the last few years, well, for quite a long time, but especially over the last few years, with private equity firms buying out sort of single owners who've owned them for a long time, building up huge debt loads and sort of sucking out a lot of money. So the problem is you can't say we're just going to invest a load of money in social care without thinking about the market, because it could just disappear to the Cayman Islands. There's a bit of thinking about that on the childcare side, because they've said they want schools to do a lot more childcare, which, although they haven't really said how they're going to make that happen, but I think that's the right ambition. But on the social care and the children's residential care, there's really no sense that there's any thinking yet about how to get us out of this absurd situation where we're throwing taxpayer money at very expensive private sector funded places, essentially.
And I think this is a great phrase that Starmer uses often, which is moving away from the sticking plaster politics and really thinking long term about how you solve some of these structural problems in society. Then you really, really would hope that care is absolutely up there.
One of the big sort of growth proposals is around housing, to build 1.5 million houses over the next 5 years. The Conservatives put 1.6 in their manifesto, I think, just to be higher, without any kind of plan as to how to do it. But do you think politically, Claire, that that's going to hold, just because governments always say we want to do planning reform, and then you get in and Royal Society of the Protection of Birds pops up and the National Trust pop up, and your MPs in more rural constituencies, which there probably will be this time, pop up, and it gets all a bit harder? Do you think, unlike all the other governments, this time they'll actually do it?
Well, I think it's interesting is that this is one of the fights Starmer has chosen to pick. And there's lots of fights he's chosen not to pick. And this is one where he said, yes, we're going to run towards this one because it is so critical to getting our infrastructure built. And it is also partly what the Labour team have learned from what the Biden administration have got right and wrong. They didn't, in the US, make the reforms to their permitting system early enough. So when you turn on the taps in terms of the investment, it hasn't been able to flow into the US in the way that it would have needed to have really delivered early enough. So I think the Labour team have listened. I think they're right to put planning up front. But again, it's alone is a huge piece of structural reform to take on. Can you imagine if we think back of, let's play fantasy politics, my fantasy, Sam's, not yours, that Labour win, maybe they even win 2 terms. What is the thing that we would remember, the defining legacy of this next Labour government? And I would love it to be a new generation of home ownership. I'd love it to be succeeding on planning. But we've talked about over the course of this conversation quite a number of different things. So it's not just that you have just to pick one thing, but if you're going to go for planning, they're going to really make a lot of enemies. And therefore, you're going to have to get that lined up in such a significant way that I think that they need to consider really putting so much energy into it up front, because otherwise I think we're at risk that it doesn't happen. It hits all the roadblocks that the Tories have hit, and we know how that goes.
And in terms of the internal Labour Party dynamic, Ayesha, this is a policy area that will sit within Angela Rayner's brief in the role that she's going to do. Do you think she will see it as something that can be her legacy, something that can be her kind of statement that she can build on for her sort of her own ambitions? Do you think it will sort of get caught up in tensions between her camp and Starmer's camp, or do you think they can work together to make it happen?
Well, I think this is going to be a tension that not just applies to Angela Rayner, but it applies to everybody who is lucky enough to become a Secretary of State. Everybody who gets a big brief is going to feel huge pressure from all their stakeholders and the public and the media and the world to deliver fast and to be a hero in their field. Now, the reality is you can have very big ambitions from a departmental point of view, but then we all know, having worked around government, where things get really gnarly is when you then have to go and sit down with Rachel Reeves or Darren Jones or Torsten Bell, as I'm sure he'll probably be parachuted into the Treasury pretty quickly. That's when you start to have those really, really difficult conversations. And I think one thing which is going to be really interesting to watch is how the centre tries to better manage some of those rows and some of those tensions. And certainly from people I've spoken to, they're quite keen to make sure that departments just don't work in silos, but try and work in a way which is a bit more cross-cutting, so that everybody tries to have a sense of ownership over the agenda, so that the success and failure is shared across a number of people. Because I think the thinking is, if it all just comes down to Angela to build houses, well, that doesn't make any sense, because housing is a really big cross-cutting issue on many levels. You could look at health, particularly around preventative health issues. That's massively cross-cutting across education. It's cross-cutting with housing and even transport as well. So I think one of the big challenges is just the political management of all these big issues and all these priorities. Because if you look at somebody like Angela Rayner, yes, of course, planning and house building is on her remit. Homelessness is also going to be under her remit. And I think it's already been briefed out that she is going to get a sort of homelessness unit and try and tackle homelessness the way the Blair government did. We know she's a former carer. She's going to really want to honour her background as a care worker and honour her relationship with the trade unions to make sure there's progress on that. But no one person can do all of this stuff. And this, Nick, I'll be interested to hear your view on this, given that so many advisors have just been parachuted into Labour seats, given that even though I think there's a really, really good PLP and really good shadow ministers, they're still quite inexperienced. How do you think the kind of delivery side of things from the centre is going to work?
Well, I think with a large majority and with lots of talented people coming through, I think you have a political management challenge about your cabinet and your junior ranks and how you refresh them. I don't expect people to stay in their posts as long as they perhaps have done in previous governments, because I think Starmer will want to bring and have to bring people through.
And that's going to cause problems, right? That's going to cause issues.
Yeah, it will. I hope that Labour doesn't come into the centre of government and spend a lot of time trying to create very complex means of managing from the centre. So I'm not in favour of creating a kind of executive group of the cabinet. And I think that, the balance has to be struck between departmental responsibilities and what the centre wishes to enable and achieve. I think the Treasury will be powerful. It always is. I suspect with Rachel Reeves, it'll be very powerful, and lots of the big decisions will be taken in the first budget and the first spending review, and they will completely set the tone for the whole of the Parliament. So whatever else you do in the centre of government, whether you try to create new kinds of machinery or delivery units or whatever you do, actually a great deal of what will happen in the Parliament will be determined by those big fiscal events. So that's where a lot of the action will be. I also do think, firstly, it's important that Rayner doesn't go the way that Prescott did. Prescott got given far too much in 1970, had a huge ministry. She's got a big ministry, so she's going to have to really select her priorities, be really politically smart. Although, if you look at the manifesto, what's in it, it does reflect the fact that she's achieved a certain level of status and power in the party. And then the other thing is joining up at a local level, like going back to the point Sam made about devolution to mayoral or combined authorities. I mean, if we want to have more prevention, more health, in urban development, better public transport, municipal bus companies, all of these things, then you've got to join up those policies at the level of empowered local and combined authority government. And that's where the action really happens. And so I do want real thought to be given to that beyond what's in the manifesto, to ensuring that combined authorities have the resources, powers, responsibilities to be able to achieve those big policy tasks of urban development, of linking transport with housing, with health, well-being, employment support. They've been given actually not much remarked on, but there's quite a big devolution of employment support and Job Centre Plus to the mayors and the combined authorities in the manifesto. That's the sort of thing that I think gives you a kind of architecture of the future and of success.
That was one of my reflections, was about change. So change is the name of the manifesto. the word was emblazoned everywhere at the launch today. Labour have been giving a message of reassurance, actually, and the first part of the manifesto is all about the foundations, security, stability. If Labour are going to embark, as the manifesto promises now that it will, on a big change programme, how do you think Labour needs to mobilise an army of communicators to engage people in that change? Because I think the Metro mayors who were all present at the launch today are going to be really, really important, because actually you could end up with lots and lots of fights over planning or care or local government finances absolutely everywhere. And it could tank all quite quickly if there is not a clear story to the public. What do you think about whether Starmer and co are going to do government in a different way, in a way that engages businesses, the Metro mayors and others in communicating what this big change programme is?
I think this is such a critical question because over the last 14 years, certainly, arguably over the last 30 years, gradually communications have eaten policy and it tends to drive the policy agenda. It certainly has the last few years. And that's been incredibly destructive. For me, this big question is will Starmer's team reverse that and go back to policy first? Then you communicate the policy. Of course, that is critical. You have to communicate the policy effectively, but communication shouldn't drive the policy decisions that you're making. There are all sorts of little signals you could send straight away that would signal that you were going to do that. You go into Downing Street, what's on the first floor? The communications team. Where is the policy team? Up on the third floor. Like, change that around. Little signals like that just would say that policy is now taking precedence again. And actually, I think that would allow you to communicate it more effectively because you've got something real to communicate. Whereas at the moment, what you're doing is communicating announcements that have nothing behind them. And I just don't know whether they've got the bravery, I guess, to do that, or whether they're going to feel like, yeah, we're going to stick to the model that Alistair Campbell created and then the Tories have taken to an extreme and start almost with the communications and then follow up with the policy.
I agree with a lot of that. I mean, obviously, being from a communications discipline myself.
It's all your fault, Ayesha. You're the comms pad who throws us poor policy people out.
I was waiting for that. I'd go for a third way on this, obviously. I think it's about integrating the comms and the policy much earlier. It shouldn't be that the comms drives everything, but there's no point all the kind of, I don't mean to be rude saying the boys, but the policy boys, like, sit in a room and come up with the whizzy ideas, and the comms people are completely shut out, like the sort of the sense check on it, and then it's sort of presented to the world and it's out, right, you go and deliver the comms. I think it's got to be sort of integrated. But Claire, I think your question is brilliant. I think it needs to be much broader. I think you've hit on something really important. And this is what I really hope. I hope there's a bit of a renaissance in terms of the business of politics and how decisions are made under a new government. And I'm not expecting it all to be kumbaya and have, mass meetings of thousands of people and everything being done by consensus, because you just can't operate like that. But I do think there is a wealth of talent in the nations and regions. I think it would be really depressing and self-defeating if there was like a command and control sort of bunker mentality. We can't afford to do that from an election point of view anyway. There are massive elections happening in Scotland in 2026. If the team in Westminster aren't kind of talking to Anas Sarwar and his team like on a daily basis to make sure that by the time we're in the pitch rolling up to 2026 in Holyrood, we have got in the pipeline some good tangible results that can be shown in Scotland. So I think it's more than just comms. It is about, I think, trying to have a different way of doing government.
On that note, I think we need to wrap up. So all the way through the last few weeks, we've been asking our guests to give us their fantasy member of the new Starmer cabinet. Can be dead, alive, fictional, non-fictional. So who do you want influencing this manifesto in the cabinet? I will start with you, Claire.
I want it to be the public.
We're all getting into the cabinet.
But I want the people who may be responsible for putting a Labour government in to have a pipeline into that cabinet every single meeting. Because if we do not have a conversation with the public through these big, difficult changes, and if we don't involve them in the way that politics is done in the future, we are going to come unstuck really quickly. So I vote for the public being in my fantasy manifesto writing and delivery unit.
Yeah, I thought the question was, who do you want to get to write the manifesto? And I think it would be every sort of Labour person's fantasy that George Orwell would be your manifesto drafter because of the brilliance of his prose and his instructions on how to write. So I would nominate Orwell to be drafting the manifesto. I think that would be an interesting. The other person, actually, I've been doing some work on him recently, is Tom Paine. If anybody can turn big ambitions and big arguments about change into popular prose and take people with him, it's Tom Paine. Common Sense and Rights of Man. I was reading him this morning thinking, actually, having him put pen to paper would have been a pretty good thing too.
I'd be pretty happy with Orwell and Paine writing a manifesto. That'd be pretty nice.
I'd like Taylor Swift to be writing our manifesto because she's just the best communicator on the planet and is all powerful and gets stuff done. She basically rules the world now. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And if you are not a member of the Power Test crew, you can head to the powertest.co.uk or thepowertest.substack.com. You'll get episodes ad-free and early before anyone else. And there's also an exclusive chance to be part of the podcast and lots more. Also, do get involved with us if you've got any questions or comments or ideas you'd like us to explore. We'd love to hear from you. You can email us on pod@thepowertest.co.uk. You can also get involved on social media as well.
And we've also got our brand new YouTube channel, which is Power Test Pod, and you can find clips on there. The Power Test only exists because of the amazing support from you, our members, and our supporters. And we're also delighted to have the backing of some brilliant organisations like the Future Governance Forum, which is providing intellectual and practical infrastructure vital to the revival of progressive government in the UK, and the Centre for Progressive Policy, a think tank championing inclusive economic growth. We're also really glad to have support from the Institute for Global Change, who provide us with exceptional research and briefings, and also partner with the fantastic Labour List, bringing to life many of the issues, themes and discussions we're covering on the pod.
Need new glasses or want a fresh new style? Warby Parker has you covered. Glasses start at just $95, including anti-reflective, scratch-resistant prescription lenses that block 100% of UV rays. Every frame's designed in-house with a huge selection of styles for every face shape. And with Warby Parker's free home try-on program, you can order 5 pairs to try at home for free. Shipping is free both ways too. Go to warbyparker.com/covered to try 5 pairs of frames at home for free. warbyparker.com/covered.
Hi, this is Paige from Giggly Squad, and I want to talk to you about Splash Refresher and my water intake. Okay, so you guys obviously know that I'm a hydrated girly, but sometimes when you drink that much water, it starts to just taste bland, and you're just like, I need something to spice it up. That's why I love Splash Refresher. It has 0 sugar, 0 calories, and it's a splash of sweetness. And they come in 5 different flavors. They're so good. Wild berry, acai grape, pineapple mango, lemon, and mandarin orange. My favorite is the wild berry because I just love a berry. So if you're like me and you're drinking water all day, then try Splash Refresher. It's going to absolutely change your water game, and it's good for you.
The living room is where you make life's most beautiful memories. But your sofa shouldn't be the one remembering them. The new life-resistant, high-performance furniture collection from Ashley is designed to withstand all the spills, slip-ups, and muddy paws that come with the best parts of life. Ashley high-performance sofas and recliners are soft, on-trend, and easy to clean. Shop the high-performance furniture in-store or online at ashley.com. Ashley, for the love of home.